This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the fourth Tuesday of every month throughout 2023, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West. I'm very excited about this year-long series, and I greatly appreciate the Nature Conservancy's generous support. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in Colorado and around the world, visit www.nature.org/Colorado. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guests today are Matt Moorhead and Galen Guerrero-Murphy. Matt and Galen are conservationists who work for the Nature Conservancy on its Southern High Plains initiative, a collaboration between 5 states with the shared goal of protecting the nation's grasslands. The Southern High Plains encompass approximately 71 million acres across Colorado, Kansas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. The region is home to some of the country's most important grasslands, as well as the people and wildlife who depend on the invaluable shortgrass prairie ecosystem. Officially, Matt is TNC's Conservation Business and Partnership Development Advisor, and Galen is TNC's Land Conservation Program Manager. But at their core, they're both relationship builders. As you'll hear in this conversation, both Matt and Galen work tirelessly to build long-term, rock-solid partnerships with landowners and conservation partners, with the goal of finding win-win solutions that can be mutually beneficial for all parties. Through genuine curiosity, creative thinking, and a deep respect for landowners and their legacy, Matt and Galen have helped to implement lasting conservation outcomes on the Southern High Plains. The three of us connected virtually and had a fascinating conversation about grasslands, ranching, building relationships, and purpose-driven work. We started out by defining exactly what constitutes the Southern High Plains and why this is such an important region for conservation. We then discussed why the large percentage of private ownership creates such a compelling case for conservation, the need for balancing conservation with various forms of energy development, the current markets around grasslands carbon sequestration, and the all-important role of TNC's partners. We also talk about Matt and Galen's mentors, how they measure conservation success, and some of their favorite books. I've considered Matt and Galen to be friends and mentors for many years now, so I was grateful for the opportunity to talk with them on the podcast. Hope you enjoy. Matt and Galen, my longtime friends, Matt and Galen. I've known you guys since even before I started the podcast, I think, which is crazy. And Matt, I've told you this, but you might not remember it, but you were one of the first people that when I was interested in conservation and had moved to Colorado and didn't know anybody, you agreed to go out to eat lunch with me. And you were so nice to me from the beginning. You welcomed me into the conservation organization. We went off on many tangents about Theodore Roosevelt and World War II. But I'm just really glad to have both of you on here because, you know, personally, you're great friends and conservation mentors to me, but also you're just doing such important work. So thanks for taking the time. And since we got 2 of you on here, I was thinking maybe the best way we could start out is for each of you to kind of introduce yourself so we can put a voice with the name. And maybe if you could just tell your name, you know, how long you've been working at TNC and kind of what you do there. And then we'll move on to the main event. But Matt, you want to go first?
Yeah, Matt Moorhead with the Nature Conservancy here in Colorado for 25 years, actually. And during that time, most of that 25 years, I work at the intersection of the Nature Conservancy's sort of conservation planning and conservation goals, you know, the science-based goals. What do we think to sustain a healthy natural world? Where do we need to be doing conservation efforts, and what does that need to look like? How do we protect the natural systems? So my role in that is basically to kind of be at the intersection of our organizational science strategic vision of, hey, what do we need to do to make sure that the world can function for future generations? Between that and the stakeholders, the communities, the funders, the partners, the landowners, my job is to tie all those threads together and hopefully find places that we can go put conservation on the ground that's going to last.
That's great. And Galen?
Yeah, well, really happy to be here with you, Ed, and to join Matt as well during this conversation. I'm Galen Guerrero-Murphy. I've been with Nature Conservancy here in Colorado for just over 7 years now. I've been working with Matt closely the entire time, and I was hired to run large ranchland protection projects in eastern Colorado. And more lately, I've been directing what we call our Southern High Plains Initiative, which is kind of the body of work that Matt and I have been deeply embedded in and kind of exemplifies an expansion of our work from eastern Colorado into some of our neighboring Great Plains states.
Yeah, well, thanks, guys. And I mean, I really do credit TNC and Cattlemen's with my appreciation and growing love of the plains. You know, I moved to Colorado because, like most people, I was obsessed with the big mountains. And I remember one time we did an overnight trip out with Cattlemen's and with TNC out to the J.E. Canyon Ranch, which is a great conservation success story. And I really just went so deep with you guys and then with some of your ecologists and really just got a full understanding of both the ecology of the Great Plains and of eastern Colorado and the Southern High Plains, and then the amazing conservation opportunity that is there. And so I was maybe the best way to start out is could one of you describe, like when we're talking about the Southern High Plains, what are we talking about and why is that such a great conservation opportunity?
Well, Matt, we're going to have a fun time kind of dividing and conquering. My mouth is open, so I'm going to take it. But we are definitely going to be a tag team effort here. I would summarize the Southern High Plains Initiative. You know, internally, it's looked like a growth and scaling thing for our team and for our work. But from an outsider's perspective, I would characterize this as a regional conservation initiative working to fire on all cylinders, including in TNC, but also across the partner landscape, across the local community landscape, with all of the many land managers and landowners that call the Southern High Plains home and the many residents of the various towns, to build a really meaningful conservation story that achieves success for biodiversity, success for climate, and success for the people who call this place home and really depend on these landscapes for their livelihoods. Of course, we can talk about kind of our conservation goals and what partners are up to, but I see it as really kind of a broad partnership effort to achieve really meaningful outcomes for a large community of really important grassland ecosystems that we call the Southern High Plains. And
can you describe geographically, like what we're talking about, the land area, maybe, you know, for somebody who's not familiar at all, can you kind of describe the actual area that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think a decent way to kind of envision it is roughly take the size of the state of Colorado. Our planning boundary is about 70 million acres, but depending on what partner you're talking to, that boundary is kind of amorphous. But kind of shift that square, put Colorado in your mental image, and then shift that square to the south and east, to where you pick up all of kind of southeastern Colorado, northeastern New Mexico, western Kansas, western Oklahoma, and the Texas Panhandle. To the north, it's kind of loosely kind of Arkansas River watershed, and to the south, Canadian River watersheds. And we go from west above 14,000 feet to east to some of the lower elevations around 2,000 feet in western Oklahoma.
Is your a way to think about it, as you're driving down I-25,
Mm-hmm.
as you look to the west, that first crest of mountains, Sangre de Cristo, sort of Front Range in the Arkansas Basin, you're looking at the western edge of what we call the Southern High Plains. And then, as Galen was saying, extends all the way out into the central prairies of Kansas and Oklahoma.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And so TNC, obviously global conservation organization, has the funding and the know-how and the conservation horsepower to decide on what they want to go after and go after it very, very effectively. What is it about this specific region that captured the attention and the resources of this global organization that is TNC and made all of you collectively think, all right, this is one of the most important places. I mean, you could argue on planet Earth that needs to be, I mean, definitely in North America, this is where we need to be putting our resources, putting our manpower. I mean, Matt, you've devoted I'm not trying to make you feel like an old man. You've devoted a quarter century to this region. I mean, so why, whether it's the size of the ranches, the ownership of the ranches, what is it that is so critical about this region?
I think I'm going to sort of start by actually dialing it back from the global organizational scale.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, the global organization doesn't have some centralized grand plan. Mm-hmm. What the global organization has done, it has put people driven by sort of personal values and philosophies to want to protect nature. And it's put them out across the country, across the world, and said, help us figure out what we need to do in these places. So I want to kind of set that as the preamble, because why the Southern High Plains is become increasingly an organizational priority for the Nature Conservancy is because we had a tremendous convergence of a group of dedicated people in the Nature Conservancy, in conservation partners, and critically, for the Southern High Plains, people who lived in the Southern High Plains, people from the ranch community, the multi-generational landowners, the people whose heritage is stamped in the land. And we simply got to know each other to where you earned the invitation to go and see some of these ranches, see some of these lands, see what lived there, see how their lives merged with healthy natural systems. And essentially over time, the reason it became a priority is because people who got to know each other and got to trust each other looked at the place and what it meant today and looked at the future and were worried about it for the future and said, well, then let's do something about it. Essentially just started experimenting. Years and years ago, started experimenting with, hey, how can conservation play a role? How can conservation not just be natural resource conservation, not just be a goal in and of itself, but how can it also be a tool to work on things like community viability? How can ranching families who are worried about generational succession, about who comes next, who's going to take care of this, how can conservation play a role in that? It's looking at things like direct land conservation. What are legal strategies like conservation easements, sort of shepherding at-risk properties to new owners who are going to protect and manage it in the future. But it's also looking at management questions. It's things like what are more cost-effective and resource-compatible ways for managing cattle? How do we eradicate invasive species that impact nature and impact the bottom line for ranching and farm families? So I know this is a little bit long-winded, Ed.
No,
but
I love it.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back to the reason this is a priority is not top-down from a global organization. The reason this is a priority is bottom-up, because people who got to know each other and discovered that while we may use different words, we care about the same thing, and said, then let's get other people to care about it too. One of the huge things in the grasslands that it's so funny in this country, you could be walking in Denver and strike up a conversation with somebody about natural resources and conservation here in Colorado, and 95+% of them are all going to think you're talking about the mountains to the west.
Yep.
And if they think about the history of the Old West, what formed the Old West, so many people have this mental image that it must mean the mountains because, the prairies, well, that's just not very interesting. That's where you put airports. When you really look at it, where were the bison? Where were the dominant numbers of elk? Where were all these things? They're out in the prairie. Where was the homesteading era? Where was the so much of the Santa Fe Trail? Where were all these things happening? They were out in the prairie. Mountain was hard living. It gets cold in the winter.
Yeah.
The prairies were where both wildlife and people found it easiest to settle. That's where sort of the natural history and the human history was written, was out of the prairies. And we forget that. We like to say, but it's not pretty. Usually when somebody tells me that, it's because they've never been out there. They've never had somebody show them just how extraordinarily beautiful it is. So they point to the mountains, and then they may also reference, I went to Africa and I just had such an amazing wildlife experience in Africa, and oh my gosh, that's conservation. That's what it should be. And then you point out to them, well, probably where you went in Africa was probably grasslands. Mm-hmm. It was the prairie in Africa. Southern High Plains exists because we learn to tell sort of that story. The local community members, conservation partners, we've learned to tell the story that place matters too. And there are still things out there that will blow your mind away, and we can't afford to lose them.
I think that's a great summary. And it reminds me of that book by Dan Flores about called American Serengeti. I mean, when I read that, it was after I'd spent that time with y'all out at the Jay Canyon Ranch, and it all kind of came together about the importance of this region. One of the things I remember from that presentation that I saw was that this region is uniquely set up, even, as so much of the West has been developed and chopped up into tiny little pieces, that this region of the West is still made up of, while it is private land, it's large tracts of private land. And so there's an opportunity to work with landowners and build these relationships and try to come up with mutually beneficial solutions so that you can conserve land in relatively big chunks. I mean, we're not talking about like you go up around the Roaring Fork Valley or something like that, you'll be lucky to get a few hundred acres. But where you guys are operating in the Great Plains, you can get tens of thousands of acres if you can find solutions that work for the landowner. And then you're able to, over the course of a number of transactions, impact hundreds of thousands of acres of land. So could one of you, maybe Galen, could you talk a bit about how this predominantly private land ownership and big ranches allows you guys to be very impactful with your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of characterize the scale of these ranches, kind of the trend that you see is kind of smaller parcels as you go east and kind of larger as you move west. And a lot of that is related to that connection of people with place that Matt was describing, just in terms of the primary productivity of these ecosystems and how much land one really needs to manage to achieve some sense of kind of economic and social productivity in these semi-arid landscapes. Just kind of building on kind of Matt's comments and to lead us into this, across this region, roughly half of this landscape is in some kind of relatively intact. Actually, half is actually in highly intact, very good condition, and then beyond that, it's a mix of like cropland and various different condition lands. And those lands really represent some of the world's, most amazing grassland ecosystems. And as you've pointed out here, Ed, the vast majority of what we call the Southern High Plains is in some form of private land ownership. And so it does fundamentally kind of change how we approach conservation. And Matt's been touching on this in terms of the relationship with the people there. It's, this is fundamentally their project. And what we find is, through these relationships with some of these large landowners, some of these large land managers, is pretty quickly we can start arriving at some kind of win-win opportunities. We can use conservation to see the world similarly. We share a lot of similar values in terms of nurturing and stewarding biodiversity alongside agricultural productivity, for example. And so I think the Nature Conservancy and our many various conservation partners I think bring a strong value proposition to land stewards, across this region and beyond, of course. And to your point, Ed, given that a lot of this landscape is still in relatively large land ownership holdings, there's kind of a tactical and strategic element for conservation where we can actually achieve success with, a couple landowners and get very, very large scales of outcomes. Mm-hmm. Now, this comes with some tension and trade-offs that, our conservation community and locals are aware of, and I think increasingly cognizant of, integrating into how we approach our work. So I'll just share an example. A lot of the largest land ownership holdings are in kind of western parts of the SHPI, which stem back to Mexican land grant days where, Mexican citizens were accumulating, up to like millions of acres, for example, and kind of different stuff in open range in Texas, for example, that still remain to this day. And there's been some division and some parcelization, but some really large land ownership holdings where we've got some really cool opportunities to achieve conservation wins with these owners or managers. But we really can't forget that history there. Why are these parcels still so large? And how do we continue to push a vision of abundance, of conservation for everyone across these communities that have some tense histories?
That makes a lot of sense. Matt, you talked about this a second ago, but when I think about both of you guys individually and then the impactful work of TNC and your partners out east, my frame of reference when I, selfishly, I think about Eastern Colorado because that's kind of been my experience. But when we're talking about this project, it goes beyond that. But I feel like if I had to just boil down, why have you guys been so successful with this into one word? It's relationships. Mm-hmm. And it's not fancy conservation tools. It's not fancy deeds and, all this high tech science and all that kind of stuff. It is because you've been out there for over 2 decades now. And before that, I guess, but Matt, you've been there 25 years building these relationships. And I've had the pleasure of being in meetings with landowners with y'all. And Matt, I feel like with you specifically, and Galen, I'm sure you do the same thing, but in my experience with Matt, you're thinking long-term and you're looking to build these relationships slowly and build a really good foundation and build up this trust and really get to know what the landowners need for their, economically and even emotionally. And so, Matt, I was wondering, I wish you could talk a little bit about that process of building these relationships. I mean, maybe you could talk about when you started out 25 years ago. Was it daunting going out there and trying to build these relationships up one at a time? Because like me, you're not from around here. We're outsiders. Can you talk about that process of building these relationships so solidly and gradually over many years?
Partly, I guess I never really thought about it that way. Mm-hmm. When I started out, I was just so excited and curious about being able to meet these people and learn their histories themselves, learn the histories of their land, learn the histories of their community. Ed, you're the same way. You're sort of a history junkie. Yeah. I've always found it easier if I'm genuinely curious about something. I think that comes across just like you. If you have the curiosity where you're willing to invest the time, whether it's books or spending time on the road, spending time at the table over coffee with somebody, I think that curiosity manifests as respect to a certain degree. At least it starts that way. I think it really started at that basic level, which I was happy to be there. I wasn't necessarily daunted. I was aware that I was other. I was aware that I was an outsider, and it wasn't me alone as well. I mean, it was Chris Pegg, a number of other folks and colleagues over the years. But the single biggest thing that I think I've ever seen for the Nature Conservancy, for other partners that matters, is being able to come to the table, not sort of quietly demonstrating impatience, which is, okay, yada, 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 we need to get to the nuts and bolts of what we want from you. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes, too often, society manifests that way, which is, yada, 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 let's get past the pleasantries here. What's the business here? And if you cannot start that way, but actually start with, you're really interesting. I want to learn more about you. I want to learn more about your history. How'd your family get here? What matters to you all? What do you care about? You find those overlaps. You find those places that turns out we're not so different after all. We may use somewhat different words for the same things sometimes, but as often as not, we care about the same things. We care about family. We care about community. We care about going outside on a beautiful day and being able to breathe in and say, this makes me feel better. Mm-hmm. We care about that. And so, in a way, I don't think I ever really thought about it back then as consciously partnership development. I thought about it as just, I'm so lucky about here and getting to meet these people and learn about this stuff. Oh my gosh, the landowner took me to a homestead where there was still a shirt hanging on a peg. Yeah. That they could tell the story of whose shirt that was when they abandoned the property in the middle of the Dust Bowl back in the 30s and left that sweat and sorrow stained shirt hanging on a peg in a homestead. When you have the opportunity where somebody can take you and show you that and tell you the story of who that still was, I don't know. It becomes easier in the relationship because I think it's really genuine. Where you're like, that's amazing. That is amazing. And then when you can walk out of that homestead and look at a landscape that is still intact and looks largely the way that person who left in the 30s, it looked the way that it would have looked when they got there in the teens, though. And there's not many places left where you can work at that scale and say that, where the history is as intact as the land.
Yeah, I completely agree that the enthusiasm and authentic curiosity, it shines through, and I'm not comparing myself at all to all the great stuff you've done. But I think if, there's any way that I've been able to make a life and a career out here with the Southern accent is because I am genuinely interested. I mean, I want to know. And I think if anything, that's why I was better at conservation than selling real estate, because it was almost like I felt bad when I would be talking with the rancher to eventually have to get around to like, well, hey, can I help you sell your ranch? Because I just wanted to learn more about what they were doing and figure out, really get in with all the history of their family. And so I'm with you on that.
Well, Ed, can I just a critical point, I think, to sort of build off, because I think we're sort of seeing a little bit of this the same way. Being able to build those kinds of connections based on that, hey, let's find that, not just sort of the common understanding, but the common curiosity. Partnerships work best, in my experience, when you get to a place where you can genuinely understand the partner's goals enough that you can truly and respectfully say, hey, I'm going to adopt a part of your goal. Your local community ranching goals have enough families to be able to still be here in place to sort of have a viable community and viable economics. You know what? That doesn't go against my goal, or that doesn't go against the goal of the Nature Conservancy. So I'm going to adopt that goal too. Until you really have that opportunity to know the people in the community well enough, it's hard to, people are like, well, I'm here for my organization or for my purpose, and it's this. You're going to get to your purpose oftentimes better because you're going to get support from the other people who are already there if you can adopt their purpose too. And so to me, it all just sort of coalesces together. That curiosity leads to the relationship building, leads to the trust, and leads that ability to say, hey, your goal can be my goal.
And I think fundamentally then better outcomes and best in class conservation, Matt. I've been thinking about the element of kind of the relationships that we need to really take authentically, and how diverse the perspectives are in work, and how conservation can really bridge a lot of kind of divides and help heal, which is phenomenal. But another relationship that I think is just phenomenal to lean into is like, how do people relate to the land and nature? And I think that's, as we build relationships with folks in Eastern Colorado, to then see how we relate to nature in these very interesting, similar ways is quite phenomenal. But it's bringing to mind, you hear a lot lately, and I think the conservation community is really looking hard at kind of their history of practices and how to be better into the 21st century. And you hear kind of colonial conservation coming up again and again. And this is something we're attempting to stem and mitigate. And I think I can safely say that, learning and working with Matt for the last 7 years and kind of seeing what we're trying to build in the Southern High Plains, we are working in partnership with the local communities. And there's always opportunity to add and include, more voices into what that is. But it is so essential, I think, for conservation to embrace that approach of, this is for us, this is for you, this is, a problem that we are kind of causing and needing to solve together. Mm-hmm. And we're not out here building museums for nature. This is a relationship between people and nature. And I think the dynamics of just humans relating across these divides in conservation that Matt and I are constantly, confronting and building opportunities out of. I think it's how we have to do this work, I think, for kind of durability and stickiness and good outcomes for everybody.
Yeah, Galen, you're dead on. If we're not able to sort of genuinely adopt the goals of the people in the community we're working with, we're a creative species. And so if local communities, if people's goals aren't accommodated as well, they'll figure out how to undo at some point conservation. Conservation has to matter to their own goals, not just ours.
Great points. One kind of specific question, and this is probably for listeners who may not be all that familiar with the specifics of conservation, like how this all works. But you think about agricultural producers, and sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they're a big portion of their revenue, or a portion of their revenue can come from energy development, whether that's oil and gas, or whether that's different types of renewable energy, which is obviously growing. How does TNC and just conservation partners in general out in the Southern High Plains, how do you balance the need to allow landowners flexibility around energy development and the revenue that can come with that, with the need and the desire to conserve landscapes? Can you just talk a bit about the kind of the balancing act there?
You start, Galen.
Oh boy, give me the easy one. Well, prior to joining TNC, I was with an environmental consulting firm called TRC, where I not in the Southern High Plains, but mostly out east and out west. I did do some renewable energy and transmission planning and development and permitting, and so I have kind of a nuanced perspective on some of this. What we as an organization and some of our partners have been able to kind of identify is, if we take renewable energy goals seriously, and TNC does, and we are pushing for, rapid deployment of renewables as a climate strategy. Obviously, that raises some tension with kind of biodiversity goals, local landowner goals, both good and bad. And what we've, worked on is there a future reality where we can achieve really aggressive renewable energy build out and still have, beautiful places, high conservation value lands, agriculturally productive lands, food security, water systems that still work. For me personally, I can see a future where we have technologically solved climate change, but we've forgotten about nature.
Yeah.
And we've forgotten about important, beautiful open spaces and what that means for people, both socially and economically. So in the Southern High Plains, we know there is enough land available for a ton of renewable energy that would not compromise kind of the overall conservation landscape. And that would be focusing our development on either, less high quality or more degraded lands, open cropland, fringes of rural centers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do you actually implement that vision? That is extremely challenging. We don't want to get away of folks' kind of economic opportunities. And so there is definitely clear tension there. TNC has taken an approach to basically plan out a future scenario that has worked, but we haven't done anything to incentivize or disincentivize one way or another. And it's a balancing act for sure. I think when I look at the Southern High Plains today, we know there's going to be a lot of renewable energy build out, and you're seeing that right now. I think a few things in terms of the differences between technology, and Matt and I talk about this a lot. We kind of like the concentrated impact of solar. Everything under solar is kind of smoked, although you could do some grazing and farming potentially. But it's dense, whereas wind is kind of, more dispersed. It doesn't compromise all the conservation values, but it's, a much larger landscape of impact. And for some species like migratory birds and bats, it's really, really a problem. So between the technologies, there are opportunities, I think, to kind of concentrate and lean into win-wins. And so I can envision a world, and you're kind of seeing this around Pueblo, where you've got some really concentrated solar developments, and maybe you're using that to finance and incentivize conservation of the higher value portions of your ranch. And so you can kind of balance the economics and the conservation values across these large landscapes. We are also working on, basically it looks like kind of the economics of the build out. So not only the land base, but like, is it economical? And we found some pretty compelling economic models that show like, yeah, actually, if you do optimize for conservation values, the economics work as well. I think what gets really challenging though is like individual landowners in a neighborhood and winners and losers. And I think that's where I'm very cautious. I don't want to over dictate outcomes for these neighbors. I think what I'm really excited to see is how ranchers and neighbors are starting to come together to talk about negotiation strategies with developers. How are they going to get a better premium, or how can they as a community try and optimize some siting decisions? And then how can we as a partner potentially help with that conversation? I'd love to be invited to that, but I'm not going to force myself into that right now. So I think that, that's kind of what's simmering in my head right now. There's a lot there to unpack though, Ed, because it's a tension point and it's a huge one.
Yeah. It's and Galen was really, it's a matter of design. Conservation is not about stopping development process. It's really about making sure that as a people, as we're designing our future of the people we want to be, as the state, the country, whatever scale you want to be at, just make sure that we've got all the pieces still in place, that we're not in such a rush to do one thing that we forget about the other things that still matter and should matter in the future. So it's the where, the when, the how do you do these things to work with nature instead of just sort of overlook it?
Another question kind of along those lines that I should know more about, but I don't, is, I feel like in my echo chamber of internet news and whatever the algorithm is feeding me, I'm hearing a lot about grasslands and sequestering carbon. And that there seems, from my perspective, with only about 10% of the information, that there may be market opportunities there for grasslands, a way to create revenue for landowners while also sequestering carbon and having, positive climate impacts. Where do things stand with grassland carbon sequestration as a method of producing possible revenue and also producing possible conservation outcomes?
Galen and I and some of our colleagues have been wrestling with this for a while. You see the opportunity as well. Everybody knows that one of the fastest ways to do carbon release is basically systemic conversion. So you're basically in the prairie stores 90+% of its carbon underground in the roots. So the fastest thing you can do is turn the prairie over. What do they say? Turn the green side down. Is one of the fastest ways to get rid of that. At the same time, oftentimes in prairie landscapes, particularly the southern high plains, is at the western edge largely of the southern Great Plains, so it's more of an arid grasslands than a wet grasslands like you might have in Iowa, western Minnesota, et cetera. And so, there's a lot of science challenges. You can people are trying to sort of figure out if improved management of grasslands is a significant carbon capture strategy. But the fact of the matter is that's hard to sort of demonstrate. You might be able to do amazing innovations in your management techniques that, from a biodiversity perspective, from a range productivity perspective, you're really making great strides in your grassland health condition. And you may find out that on an annual, your ability to measure an improvement in soil carbon capture is really small. Like, you may not be able to detect really any change in carbon based on your management, compared to if you've had 5 dry years in a row and then suddenly you have 2 wet years. You might find a huge move on carbon, relatively speaking, to your individual management. So essentially, and Galen, you can walk me back from this. I think increasingly what we're looking at from a carbon perspective is the most important carbon play in the grasslands is to keep green side up, try and limit or prevent conversion of our native prairies as much as possible, because maintaining the healthy natural prairies and keeping the carbon in place is sort of our most quantifiable strategy. On the management side of things, one of our good friends and colleagues who really works really closely with the grazing communities, grazing industry, livestock industry, on essentially different technologies, different tools and techniques to improve conservation outcomes and economic outcomes of grazing. He has long said, when it comes to carbon, the best way to monetize your improved carbon capture by healthier grasslands is through those healthier grasslands, the greater ability to grow healthier and more livestock, and essentially monetize carbon through a more successful agricultural operation, through the production of food itself.
That's all good stuff, Matt. Just a few points I would add, and I think maybe it was a UC Davis study that really hit this home, that pre-existing carbon in our grasslands is some of the most valuable, most important carbon. You can burn through the grasslands and that carbon is still there. It is highly resilient. And that's really different from what you see in forests and beyond.
Next question would be, Matt and Galen, you've both been talking a lot about partnerships, and we've talked a lot about the partnership between TNC and the landowners, but there's so many other conservation organizations and governmental agencies that you guys have worked with over the years and that make this work so important and make it so effective, I should say. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about who those partners are and a bit about what each one what they bring to the table, maybe that TNC does not bring.
For our work in the Southern High Plains, a sort of group or collection of groups that you didn't mention there directly, Ed, that I actually think is probably the most important. And that is our actual traditional agricultural partners in the organizations that represent them.
Yes.
So it is regional and statewide livestock associations. It is the collection of land trusts that increasingly we're seeing around the country that are essentially offshoots of those livestock and landowner associations directed towards conservation of productive agricultural food production lands and community sustainability. That our success in Southeast Colorado, the degree that we've had large-scale conservation success in Southeast Colorado, could not have happened if we did not find that trusted working space with our ag partners.
Yeah, I think just to echo all of that, I think what has been really wonderful for me to work, with Matt and the rest of our conservation team here is to see how fundamentally partnership is to it all. It really is not. It doesn't work with just us, and whether that's a landowner or the alliance they're a part of, it is just so front and center. Some other areas that we're kind of working on at the pace of trust and relationships that I'll throw out there are some of the indigenous communities in the Southern High Plains. There's been kind of a long history of displacement, dispossession, no formal reservation boundaries in kind of Colorado, in eastern Colorado, for example. Our reservations are in southwestern Colorado, but there's really some great opportunity to build trust with these communities and kind of see where we can go in terms of a future conservation story that is a win for everyone in this landscape. So I just want to throw that out there. It's an area for TNC and some of our tribal groups to work on together, and I think it's going to be a really interesting sort of evolution of how conservation kind of expands and evolves in this community going forward.
I just wanted to piggyback off of something that Galen was saying at sort of the start of his, and it really goes back to the scale of the conservation need, and particularly when you're working in arid western landscapes. I don't care if you're working on sustainable agriculture, if you're working on sustainable natural habitats and communities. If it doesn't rain very much, you've got to be working at a really, really large scale. And if you're working at that large scale, I'm going to go back. You mentioned TNC as being a global organization. Again, sometimes that sort of creates the wrong impression that there's all sorts of things we can do. We're working at scales that TNC can't do this by itself, even remotely. And so that's why increasingly, if you're looking, you look at any signature large-scale land conservation effort going on in the American West right now, guarantee you there are multiple conservation organizations at the table, multiple agencies at the table, and critically, local community support as well. Otherwise, it does not work.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing, Matt, ever since I've gotten to know you, I mean, that's been the thing you've said over and over and over again, that that's the most effective way to do conservation is with partners. And it's kind of really the only way to do it at the scale y'all are doing it. And so one thing, Matt and Galen, as you can chime in, I'd love to hear a little bit about why each of you pursue this work, because that's the thing that's always impressed me about the Colorado conservation community and really conservation community in general is you got all these really, really smart people that could be doing a lot of different things, and they choose to devote their energy and their brain power and really their careers to, this issue that is larger than themselves. And so I'm always curious about who people's mentors were. And so Matt, maybe you can go first. When you think of people that played a positive role in your professional development in the conservation world, who comes to mind for you?
I think I got into conservation. Really, I was one of those people lucky enough when I was younger. I spent 6 months in the woods hiking the Appalachian Trail years ago, which is sort of what drove me to a career in conservation. Honestly, it was. Came away from that feeling I needed to give back. So that's how I ended up in conservation in general. I would say the people that kind of influenced the most how I look at both the conservation mission and how I've learned to sort of maybe apply myself to getting the work done, but both through relationships and then through just sort of the simple mechanics. I'd say it's 3 people, really. I think one of them, Chris Pegg.
Yes.
Longtime ecologist for the Nature Conservancy. He's sort of been our Lorax for all these years. He speaks for the trees. Well, in my case, he speaks for the grass, speaks for the grasslands. And just really years of unbelievable windshield time with Chris. It's sort of like having your own Steve Irwin riding along with you to just, to just introduce you to the, both the details, but just the awe and the wonder of the natural world around you. Just the excitement, the ability to ask the question, well, what if we could do this? And why would we try to do this from a conservation perspective? So Chris really just opened the world of what could be to me, and why should it be, through the science. And then I think two people who just had a massive influence on how I go about my work. One is a former Nature Conservancy trustee, and who has just spent so much of his career in retirement really volunteering for nonprofits in a variety of places. His name's David Smith, out of Denver. I had a colleague who sort of said, working with David is like getting a private MBA in a way. And he's the one who's just, oftentimes nonprofits sort of view the business side of things almost with a little bit of fear or like it's magic, like complicated finance. And he's the one who really boiled it down. It's like, you know what, if you can do a statistical regression analysis of the population trends of least vole or whatever species you might want to sort of name, you can probably do the basic arithmetic that really is what most financial spreadsheets are sort of based on. And so he really took a lot of the mystery away and said, you need to be smart. Make the money work for conservation. Don't make the money a conservation challenge. And taught me how to do that. So that, and then I think somebody who just really influenced how to understand the people side of conservation and how to, we talked earlier about how to, strategies for engaging partnership. And I think what I really went down to is first just be curious and interested, engage with people as they are and where they are. And he really helped me a lot with this. He's sort of an unsung person in Colorado conservation. His name's Steve Massey. Unfortunately, he passed away earlier this year. But for the last 25 years, he's probably influenced more conservation transactions with more land trusts in more places around the state than any other single person I can think of. And he just did it out of joy. It was sort of a second hobby or second career for him, was figuring out how to make these things go. And I learned from him how to engage with people, engage with communities, and then ask the next question. So many people start with they ask a question. If the answer sounds like no, they're done. And he really taught me that no is just a data point. No is just a data point. Ask the next question. Ask why.
Love that. Galen, you got any?
Yeah, and since we work so closely together, I share some of those mentors, Steve Massey, Chris Pegg, et cetera. As I think about what kind of got me to not-for-profit conservation work, I think one of the primary catalysts was an MBA program I was in sustainability, and it was a pretty radical sustainability curriculum. But one of my mentors in that program is John Ehrenfeld, and he ran an industrial ecology program at MIT way back in the day, and really amazing kind of sustainability thought leader. But, a few things that he kind of stimulated in my own mind is kind of the idea that sustainability is often a design problem, but that it's also fundamentally an issue of what we bring meaning to. And I think for him, care is kind of fundamental to how we operate through the world and how we will achieve sustainability. And I think it really stuck in my mind in terms of how kind of deep we need to shift ourselves to achieve, outcomes around conservation or sustainability. And I think Ehrenfeld really helped catalyze in my mind the need to make a career pivot really into this conservation space. Joining TNC, I had the pleasure of meeting Matt immediately. And I think he took me down to J.E. Canyon probably within the first couple of weeks. And so, Matt, you're my mentor number one at TNC. You've really shaped the way kind of I approach the work and just everything we've been talking about today. It's just absolutely phenomenal. And to have this opportunity to work with Matt and then Chris Pegg, really, really fundamental to our team, it's amazing. It is absolutely phenomenal. So, Matt, thank you for kicking butt over 25 years and letting me learn just so much over the past 7 years for, how do we do this work together? It's amazing.
Yeah. And I'm on the outside, and Matt has been so generous with me. I mean, like when I was at Palmer, if I had particular questions, Matt would always make time to answer them and talk me through both the technical and the emotional side of things. So, Matt, there are a lot of people when people ask who are their conservation mentors, you're very high on the list.
Matt.
So, when you guys think about the Southern High Plains Initiative and the great momentum you got going, when you think out, if you do, I don't even know if you do, but you think out 10 years, 15 years, if say you could go out to the year 2033, what would make you happy? Like what would be if the program had achieved certain, I don't know if you think in metrics or if you think in relationships but what would make you happy and make you feel like, yeah, we've made some great progress here over the last 10 years?
When I look back at sort of the work that's gone on in this landscape, the work that's gone on in the communities, in the relationship building, I think it kind of points to a direction. There's going to be a lot of hard work to get here, but I also think what I'm about to how I'm going to answer your question is not crazy. It's feasible. It's the trajectory we're on. And I think the way I would answer that is to say, 10 years, 15 years in the future, what does success look like to a degree? There's a place about 15 miles east of Pueblo, Colorado, that it would be sort of the anchor of what I'm about to describe. But I think 10, 15 years in the future, if you started walking at this spot I'm thinking of 15 miles east of Pueblo, there's a chance 10 to 15 years from now, you could walk all the way south into New Mexico, turn east, sort of cross some of the panhandle into Oklahoma country, and even think about turning north up through Oklahoma into Kansas, and have a chance that across all those vast miles of private ground, that almost all of it could be connected to conservation. Mm-hmm. That there is a skeleton to build a natural future in the face of changing climate, a natural future for the natural communities that live there. That's also based on it still being private land and it's still being productive land for the history, the culture, the communities that are still there. So, yeah, that's what success to me looks like. My kid might be able to meet a kid of a rancher I know and work with, and by and large tell stories about how it's largely the same as the work we've done.
That's a great goal. I think that I completely agree. That would be a wonderful feeling. Galen, anything other than that?
Yeah, I love that. We often set our goals and kind of acreage and metrics like that, but I that's not what's going to make me happy. It's exactly what you're saying, Matt. And I'm thinking about, some of the pressure points, whether it's renewable energy or just declines in the Ogallala aquifer or just, ongoing demand for food and need for additional farmland. If we can weather a lot of system instability over the next 10 years, which is coming from us on all sides, right? We see it, whether it's, the climate or water or just our own doings in politics. There's a lot of instability. And if we can get through the next 10 years and still have, this what is really a functional working landscape where people are able to make a living, nature is able to thrive, and we've got that really big scale connectivity, as Matt, you're illuminating. Can we walk across these states and still see the prairie the whole way? Because currently we can. And I think we stand a shot over the next decade to really sustain and improve a lot of that in the face of some of these really, really big pressures.
I love that. Last question for you guys. As you both know, I'm always looking for good book recommendations. And so I'd love to hear, it doesn't necessarily have to be about the West or conservation, but if you could name a book or two that when you think about your trajectory in life, you'd say, well, that book was pretty important in my developing worldview I have. This allowed me to do this work or allowed me to become the person that I am. I know that both of y'all could go on and on like I could about different books, but I'd love just a few of your favorite book recommendations that I could put in the notes so people could try to absorb all the knowledge you guys have.
I'm going to go in two threads here to keep a realistic perspective. Something that I making sure I do annually is I go back and reread the collection of Gary Larson, Far Side, the whole collection. I can't think of a better thing where you can find relevant, resonant perspectives on the world of science, the world of conservation, the world of people than rereading that. So that, honestly, I sometimes I'll reread Charles Schultz peanuts for the same reason, only from about 1950 to about 1966 or 67. I think after that, it kind of jumped the shark. But those early days were just classic. On the more serious side, I think two I'd probably recommend. One's been out for a long, long time. That's Guns, Germs, and Steel. It helped me sort of start piercing what I'd sort of call the just lazy habit that even sort of academics, historians can kind of fall in, of having sort of a narrative of why things are the way they are, and then just being lazy and sort of always just repeating that. And Guns, Germs, and Steel sort of there to kind of look at a lot of historical human paradigms and look at it through a completely different lens. There's just how did the world shape out as far as geology and resources and natural resources? Now, not might have that shape things. Doesn't mean it's right, but it helps you think about how to ask the question differently. One I'm reading right now, The Dawn of Everything. It's a new history of humanity. It's by David Graeber, I think. And it's one that it questions sort of Guns, Germs, and Steel in a few places, but it's a really interesting take as well. The sort of questions are assumptions about the natural progression of of society, from hunter-gatherers up to the modern nation states and sort of complicated technological worlds. Is that an inherent linear process, or are there other ways that human society could evolve, could be today, and are there historical evidence for it? And so it's just a really interesting deep dive. Well, okay, you know me. It's the kind of stuff that I think is a really interesting deep dive.
Which means I think is interesting too.
Yeah. So, it's just stuff even in the conservation work, I think conservation works best. I may even have said this a little bit earlier. Conservation works best if you aren't just looking at the natural resources, but you're looking at the human layer across that landscape as well. How do people who live here, how do people view this landscape? How did they get here? Who came before? And why is it this way? And if you understand that better and can show respect for it and an understanding, it can actually help you to sort of design maybe what does that future look like to make sure we don't lose the conservation landscape component to it. So those are probably my picks for today.
Those are great. I've got Guns, Germs, and Steel on my shelf, and I've never read it. I think I'm daunted by it, but so many people that I admire speak so highly about it that I need to make myself. And I'd not heard of the second one, so those are great. Galen, you got any?
Yeah, I love this prompt. And Matt, I was not thinking about this, but when you said Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I maybe listened to an audiobook or read most of, which was phenomenal, made me think of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, slightly more modern history, but similar, like, question your assumptions. And I think that's actually pretty pertinent for global conservationists to pay attention to some of those dynamics. So that's a fun one. I was not going to mention that on this podcast, but Matt, you got me thinking about it. Here's a wonky one for you, Ed. I've been kind of rereading this. This is one I was introduced to, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, and I'm kind of sifting through it again. It's a little esoteric, but I think there's some really amazing content. It's Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, and it's The Tree of Knowledge. And they published this in 92, and they're biologists. They're kind of systems thinking biologists, but I'm going to just leave you a quote because I've been flipping through it over the last year. And I think this is just so phenomenal. It's towards the end of the book, and basically they're building up like a biological basis for consciousness and love and everything, which I really like. A little romantic, but they've got a good biological justification here. But a little quote: "We have only the world that we bring forth with others, and only love helps us bring it forth." And these are a couple of biologists, so I like this book. Newer stuff, I'm kind of an ethnobotanical nerd, so I'm always reading Michael Pollan's stuff. I'm getting through This Is Your Mind on Plants, which I don't think is his best one, but it's, I had to read the latest. And then catching up finally on braiding sweetgrass.
I've not read it.
Yeah, I'm about halfway through. I know, it gets some criticism, I think, for being a little too romantic in some respects, but the ethnobotany and just like how do humans and how does indigenous knowledge connect with place? It's really universal. I really like it, but I haven't finished it. One other on my shelf. kind of a TNC plug. I haven't gotten through it yet, but I know it's phenomenal. And this is TNC's chief scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, saving us.
Oh yeah, she was on the podcast. She is awesome.
Yeah, you had her, right? Because her book is phenomenal. I haven't made it all the way through it, but
it's a good one. It's very good, and it's it's like this conversation we're having now. She could talk science all day long, but at the end of the day, everything she's doing and the communication she's doing is about relationships and figuring out a way to talk with people on their terms. And I think that's the thing that continues to come through. I feel like with all the conservation focused conversations I have on this podcast is just this curiosity, mutual respect, finding common ground, none of this preaching or going hardcore with data and science and all that. There's a place for that. But I think at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. And you guys have been so great to me over the years, and I've learned so much from you, and I appreciate y'all taking time out of your schedule to talk with me. And I'm just glad I got a chance to catch up with you both, but really keep up the great work. And thank you for everything you're doing. I'll look forward to hanging out in person one of these days soon. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.